The weekly code quiz. We have discussed how elements are considered inline or block. What is the difference between block and inline elements? Block elements start on a new line while inline elements remain in flow. So an example of a block element is the P element. In this code where we have two paragraph elements, the second element starts a new line. An example of an inline element is the span element. You can see here that the span remains on the same line and flows into the P element. This shows the HTML code that corresponds to the home section shown. What CSS property allows you to change a block element inline or vice versa? There is a CSS property display that allows you to decide whether an element is either INLINE-BLOCK, INLINE-BLOCK, or none. What happens when you set the display property to none? When you set the display property to none, you will hide the element. What other property is often confused with display? We will compare it with the visibility property in another video. What is the difference between INLINE-BLOCK and INLINE-BLOCK? As you can imagine, inline turns a block element inline, while block turns an inline element into a block element. Finally, INLINE-BLOCK causes a block element to flow as an inline element, but the element will retain some features of a block element. We will look at some examples to clarify this behavior. In the first CSS code, we are targeting the lead-in text, which is the class attribute of our span. We have already seen that the text is italic. What we are doing in our example is to show how the different options for the display element recognize margin and padding in different ways. The addition of a gray background color will help us see the changes. With inline, our default for the span element, we can see that the margin and the padding is ignored for the top and the bottom. Changing our display to block, we see now that the span has its own line and the margin and padding are recognized all around the element. And finally, with INLINE-BLOCK, the paragraph text returns to flowing with the span element, but the span retains block properties and the margin and padding are recognized all around. In these next examples, we will look at the different display options using width and height instead of margin and padding. Starting with inline, we see that the width and the height are being ignored. We changed the display to block, and now the span again has its own line, and we see that the width and the height are being recognized. In the last example, we have changed the display to INLINE-BLOCK. Here again, the paragraph now flows into the span, however the element continues to have a fixed width and height we have set at 600 pixels wide and 30 pixels high. What is a common use of display INLINE-BLOCK? A common use for INLINE-BLOCK is in the navigation. In a previous example, we saw how floating elements can be used to create a navigation by displaying list elements horizontally. The same thing can be accomplished using INLINE-BLOCK. It is important to retain some block properties so the list elements can be styled as buttons. Here we see an unstyled navigation with an unordered list. This is the HTML code for our navigation. Now we can examine the CSS. Instead of floating elements, we are using display INLINE-BLOCK on our list elements. This causes them to display horizontally instead of vertically. And the retained block properties allow the navigation list elements to display as buttons. Presented by Designers Learn Code.